It feels like the internet has become allergic to nuance because it's easier to find a financial villain rather than understand the psychology behind why certain people think a certain way. And it's making us broke mentally and financially, which brings me to today's anonymous money confession with Money Whispers, which is this fake Reddit story that went viral. And what's even more shocking are the responses once people learn that it's fake. So today we're going to be talking about why we crave a financial villain, and in this day and age, why we're more willing to trust vibes versus truth. So today's confession is coming in from an anonymous writer who says, "Dear Money Whispers, it feels like the internet is allergic to nuance and it's killing real conversation. Case in point, a viral Reddit post recently exposed a food delivery app for swindling drivers. Except the whole thing was AI-generated fiction. Even after the hoax was debunked, the reaction was shockingly misguided. Some people double down, claiming it's okay that it's fake because it feels true, while simultaneously shaming actual drivers who begged people not to boycott their only source of income. Other people were saying, get another job, there's better systems, and you need to find them because you're part of the problem. To be honest, it's tiring seeing privileged people design perfect worlds in their head and then shame the working class for not living in them. How can we have more productive conversations about how to make money? Sincerely, deeply frustrated." Dear deeply frustrated, I want to share a quick story with you. I was on Instagram looking at my feed and I come across this Buddhist monk. He's a little bit older and he's talking about how to reduce stress and suffering. And as someone who is really into Buddhist texts, I decide to give it a go and listen to him. I found this advice really heartwarming. But then a week later, my friend tells me that this content is actually AI generated.
If you truly want to dissolve the stress in your life, you must reclaim your mornings. Every single day, give yourself 30 minutes. No phone, no tasks, no news. Just you in the silence of your room.
You can imagine how upset this made me. So I literally went back to the video and I was like, what about this makes this AI generated? And upon second, third, and fourth glance, I realized that there's no air in his voice. There's candles in the background that aren't actually flickering. And also, why would a Buddhist monk be coming on to tell people to like, comment, and subscribe on his video? It just feels not very Buddhist-like. So you could say I was sufficiently shook. And this is just one example of the multitudes of cynicism that I have with social media, which began in 2020, when I felt like content was really on the rise. COVID was fresh, everyone was at home, and I think everyone and their mother thought it was time to get into content creation. And weirdly enough, this was also when Instagram started changing their feed. My feed was no longer what my friends were doing on a Saturday night, getting drunk with their friends. It was just a bunch of suggestions about who I should follow and this curated feed of aesthetic infographics, which were probably not even fact-checked. And the thing is, it's not just me who felt this distrust. There was a Gallup poll in 2024 that said 32% of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in mass media, marking the third consecutive year that trust levels have remained below 40%. And even though most people claim to verify the information they're reading, they don't always perform the same due diligence before they're sharing the posts. More than half of social media users who share news or political posts sometimes do so without verifying the facts. I'd like to boast that I rarely use social media, and if I do, it's only for entertainment and comedy. But then my screen time would beg to differ. My screen time tells me that I'm spending an average of 34 minutes a day on Instagram. And I know that's not only from the memes that my friends are sending me. I'm subconsciously ingesting news that affects my biases and the way that I think. But in order to understand that, let's take a quick look at how our cognitive processes actually work. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this illusion before of the 3 lines. And upon first glance, even though I've seen this illusion like 100 times, I still think all 3 lines are different lengths. But of course, when you put a ruler to all 3 of these lines, you realize they are actually the same length. This is a famous illusion known as Mueller-Lyer's illusion, discussed in Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is basically a book that talks about why we have certain biases and why we think the way that we do. And they delineate the human decision-making process into 2 systems, System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 is for fast and intuitive and emotional thinking, erring on heuristics to make decisions for safety, whereas System 2 is for slow and deliberate thinking. And the first thought that may enter your head is, oh man, like System 1 thinking must be really bad, like we should only be participating in System 2 thinking. But actually, System 1 thinking is exactly operating the way that it should. According to a study, we process 74 gigabytes of data per day. That is the equivalent of 200,000 words per day, 15,000 to 20,000 songs. And this was a study that was done in 2012, and it's estimated that every consecutive year, we increase the amount of consumption in our brain by 5%. So by 2026, today, we are supposedly ingesting around 146 gigabytes of data per day, double the numbers that I just said before. So with this newfound accessibility of information, thank you, the World Wide Web, System 1 thinking is protecting our brain from information overload. That's the entire premise of a lot of self-help books. A lot of you probably are familiar with James Clear's Atomic Habits, and he talks about System 1 being a shortcut. That's why it's important for us to leave our workout clothes on the side table before we go to bed, so we're reducing the amount of decisions that we have to make in the morning. So we can save that energy for more important decisions. But System 1 can also be dangerous when we're processing geopolitical or economic news. You're not just reducing your cognitive load for good habits. You're leaving the door wide open for bad data to tiptoe in unnoticed. It becomes even worse when we start seeing that data repeatedly. There's a famous quote in Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler: slogans should be persistently repeated until the very last individual has come to grasp the idea. This is known as the illusory truth effect. When we hear false information repeated again and again, our brain starts looking at it as the truth. According to a study published in the journal Science, false stories reach 1,500 people 6 times faster than true stories do. And they're also 70% more likely to be retweeted than real stories. It's just scary because our media ecosystem is just awash with falsehoods. So it's inevitable for us to consume fake news at a certain point of our lives, even if we try to not be on social media at all. And yes, in platforms like Instagram and TikTok, they tout that they have these baseline regulations for misinformation. But what happens when a post is already going viral and you're not able to tag it as being misinformation? And to add to that, there are studies that show that social prevalence is rationally integrated into our belief updating. AKA, a viral post can update our belief system because of social proof, even if it's false. And to make things worse, there is a proliferation of AI-generated content that is coming out. We're seeing content that we're not able to discern with the human eye if it's real or not. AKA the Buddhist monk that I saw on Instagram. Humans now have a 62% accuracy rate in identifying AI images, which is not that much better than a random coin flip. And I kind of empathize because this Reddit story, even though it might be untrue, if you have a belief that the system is broken, you believe that there's some validity to that argument. And now more than ever, it requires a lot of mental fortitude to go against System 1 thinking. And this leads me to my next point, which is that when we hold values so dearly to our heart, morality is the new status symbol. When we latch onto a viral and fake story about an exploitive app that many consumers in the US are using, that gives our brain, our System 1 thinking, justification to relieve our guilt. If I boycott this, I'm a good person. We're basically outsourcing our ethics to an algorithm because doing the System 2 work, like researching labor laws, listening to the working class, advocating for a decoupled healthcare system, is just mentally and financially expensive. There's a certain guilt that people feel about the gig economy because, let's be so for real, a lot of us use rideshare apps and food delivery apps. And to make our guilt feel a little bit less, we will protest against these apps, even if that's going to hurt the income of these gig workers. This just shows that our wallet is not just a tool for purchases, it is a mirror of our cognitive biases. We don't spend money on the facts, we spend money to make sure that we're okay with the person that we're looking at every single morning in the mirror. Like, think about how Mel Robbins' Let Them theory sold over 7 million copies worldwide, because it creates a simple framework in our brain about how to not let other people affect us. And I also think about how we want to use capitalism to fix our grief and the prevalent sentiment that billionaires are evil and they're going to take over the world and space. Our brains want a silver bullet and a villain because our System 2 thinking is just too tired from the behemoths of reality and the fact that reality is not so black and white. This results in sub-optimization, which is what happens when we try to apply a System 1 solution to a System 2 problem. When you try to solve a problem piece by piece and maybe look at a problem just in isolation, rather than considering it a part of a system, you could be solving that problem, but you could also be shifting the pressure elsewhere. It's almost like a game of whack-a-mole. And I saw a really good example of this being shown by how the media covers Uber versus how the working class talks about Uber. Abby Olvera writes exactly about this. She waited tables for 6 years, getting $2.13 per hour, and she's also a DC policy researcher. She's seen both sides of the coin, and she noticed that these two worlds talk about technology completely differently. Here are some snippets from the piece that I found fascinating. She basically structures it as a critique that you'll hear from the collective versus the actual discussion that's happening amongst the working class. So one critique is that Uber doesn't offer health insurance. So media coverage often frames Uber as exploitative because it doesn't offer health insurance. But most jobs available to Abby's family members, like being a daycare worker or a retail cashier or a coat store clerk or in construction, they don't offer health insurance either. And she didn't get private health insurance until she was 23, being a diplomat. And obviously this is not ideal, but nobody in her world is angry at Uber for something that's standard across hourly work, day labor, and shift work. The bigger problem, we're treating a symptom by blaming Uber, when in reality, America ties health coverage to employment, and Medicaid is bare bones. Obviously, people in the working class have frustrations with Uber, like the fact that to drive the car, it needs to be relatively new, about 10 to 15 years old. And that restricts a lot of people because they may have to take out a lease, which adds costs and risks, and rules out using Uber as a supplemental income. And there's also the fact that Uber takes a large cut from the fares. Abby talks about how one driver told her about a ride that cost the customer $79, but he only got $19. That's an outlier example, but cuts are frustratingly high. In California, roughly a third of each fare goes to state-mandated insurance requirements. These requirements were originally supported by Uber and Lyft as a way to gain legitimacy when rideshare was fighting to exist. Now, those same mandates make it hard for more affordable, driver-friendly alternatives to enter the market. In order to better understand why the gap between media and lived experiences exists, I think we need to reframe the question entirely. We now understand how System 1 thinking operates. We use things like pattern recognition and heuristics to make sure we reduce our cognitive load so our brains are not overthinking, so that we have enough energy to make important decisions later. But the part that's a little scary about this is that the illusion truth effect that I was talking about before, that becomes harder to avoid when things like AI-generated content are multiplying at rates that are unfathomable. And it only becomes easier with Sora by OpenAI or Nano Banana Pro by Gemini. And there are a multitude of people we can blame when it comes to this, right? There are tech companies. Maybe they should be tagging their AI-generated content so we can discern fake from real. The original posters, make sure that they are fact-checking the data before they're posting it on the internet. Big oil companies, stop drilling oil and invest in renewable energy. Or the media companies, like start interviewing the working class and make sure that their perspectives are reflected in media. And obviously these are all perspectives that I agree with. Obviously I want big oil to not exist and to invest in renewable energy. Obviously I want media to reflect all perspectives. But we have to reframe the question because everyone has their own morality and their own culture, all of which is very difficult to change, especially when there are 6 flavors of morality. Thank you, Jonathan Haidt. So I want to reframe each of these questions I posed before in incentives instead. What is the incentive for a tech company to tag their AI-generated content when the incentive is to keep eyes on the platform? What is the incentive for a poster to fact-check their data when they want to keep proliferating data in a time where it feels like everyone is posting content and you need to be different in the market? What is the incentive for big oil to invest in renewables when they receive a continuous steady revenue from oil? And lastly, why would media companies interview the working class when most of their readership that is online doesn't actually intersect with the working class or the gig economy? Why would media companies feel incentivized to use Nuance when most Americans read news for less than a minute a day? And unfortunately, this just reveals that the incentive isn't always the truth, it's retention. And that's something that Nuance struggles with a lot. We're not these one-dimensional beings. We're like Russian dolls with layers of identity complexity. And when we see increases in polarization in all dimensions, like left versus right, up versus down, we lose this ability to tolerate other people and we start entering echo chambers. It's the same reason that we want to use capitalism to fix our grief or point blame at billionaires for ruining the world. Because we love putting a bow on a complex problem that can't be solved with a single solution. So rather than defaulting to cynical takes like the world is shit, everyone is bad, it's really important to have independent journalists and storytelling platforms that prioritize nuance and representation so that people's perspectives are actually heard and visible. And I'd like to predict that people are going to be craving not so black and white thinking in the very near future. So deeply frustrated, I want you to know that these platforms do exist. So I'm gonna put some links down below of platforms that prioritize nuance and storytelling. And I'm sending you a lot of love because it does feel like the world is going to trash right now. But have hope. The collective actually has a lot more power than you think it does. And with that, this is Sneha, and I'm signing off from Dear Money Whispers. I'll see you next week.